father was killed in an accident.
How could that happen? How could that happen, you know?
You could immediately see he was burned severely from head to toe.
Simplest explanation is probably the correct one. He was a known cigar smoker who was on oxygen.
But is it the result of a tragic accident or something more sinister?
Some scenes make perfect sense, but this scene completely confused me.
You could immediately see that he had no clothing on.
The worst burns were on his back, which indicated where the fire had started.
When the evidence leads to a seemingly disturbed suspect, investigators must determine whether the crime was unintentional or if it's all an act.
You knew that there was something wrong with her mind.
It certainly appears that she had poor impulse control.
We all knew she was going to take his life one day. What we were surprised about is the way that she did it.
He screamed for me. He's like, come out back. He was on fire, screaming my name.
When she told me that, I knew I was truly in the presence of evil.
June 16th, 2022. It's 5:23 a.m. in Susquehanna Township, Pennsylvania, when police receive a strange 911 call.
What's your name?
Evelyn.
Your last name?
Zigerelli, Henderson.
Tell me exactly what happened.
Yeah, I believe Carmen Q. Henderson did not make it. He,
What do you mean did not make it? No, you gotta be specific with me. I'm not understanding what you're trying to tell me.
I think he is deceased.
The 911 operator is trying to get some information. How do you know that he is passed away? Is he still breathing? And she's like, I just know.
He is deceased.
Yeah, because he's burnt.
Is there anything still burning?
No.
She said to the 911 operator that she had seen him at 1 o'clock in the morning, heard him yell, and chose at that time not to call 911. She indicated that she found him in the morning when she got up.
The dispatcher's typing this information in. It's going to the responding police officers. The dispatcher felt there was something not quite right with the caller.
Police rush to the address where they are met by Evelyn.
Corporal Alex Wagner was the first on scene. He asked what's going on, and she said, my husband's out back and he's dead.
As he's approaching the back door, he could see Mr. Henderson on the ground on the back patio.
He's just completely burned to death.
The officer immediately secures the scene and calls for backup.
As I come around the back, there's a stone patio. I look down and there is a naked, burnt man. I was completely not ready for that. I knew Mr. Henderson from years ago. He was a retired Susquehanna Township police officer, probably back in the late 70s, early 80s. Some scenes make perfect sense. You look and you can say, okay, this is likely what happened. But this scene completely confused me. And we're looking at the possibility of an accident. Maybe he set himself on fire with a cigar.
Investigators know that his wife, Evelyn, must have answers. They pull her away from the scene to get more information.
The questions running through our minds were related to the different scenarios of how this could have occurred. Most of the attention was focusing on trying to determine if this happened accidentally or intentionally.
Carmen Q. Henderson was born October 31st, 1937 in Philadelphia to a doting mother.
My grandmother, his mother, took care of, gave him everything. He had everything he wanted to have as a child.
He grew up in Germantown. They moved up to Harrisburg to change the way life was going for them. His mother worked for the orphanage, which is now the YWCA. And my dad went to school at William Penn High School.
Carmen met his first wife in high school. The pair had 2 daughters together while he served in the military.
He was an airplane mechanic in the Air Force.
When he came out of the service, he worked for Firestone as a mechanic.
Before long, Carmen decided he'd had enough of engine repair and began a new career back in Pennsylvania.
First he was a state police officer. Then after that, switched over to being a Susquehanna Township police officer.
He was one of the first minority police officers in this area. His reputation was, everybody thought he was an incredible man.
During his early career in law enforcement, Carmen and his wife separated, but he remained close to his daughters.
Even though we lived with our mother, I would see my dad every day because I would go to my grandma's house after school every day. And my dad was there, and my grandma would cook dinner, and me and my dad would eat dinner every day.
He took us to the Philadelphia Zoo. He took us to Atlantic City, New Jersey, because he liked Atlantic City. My dad took us everywhere.
Carmen was just as caring with the people in his community.
He had risen through the ranks to be a deputy sheriff in Dauphin County.
He was a good man, he was a fair man, and he was very well liked.
All different colors of people I would run into, and they would tell me that my dad helped them a lot when they were on parole and stuff. How, it changed their lives. He didn't treat them like criminals. He treated them like people. And I think that's why everybody liked him so much.
Carmen Henderson was the grandpa of the neighborhood. He was like Mr. Rogers. People loved this man.
One person struck by Carmen's charm was Evelyn Zigerelli. Born on March 4th, 1956 in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, Evelyn also seemed destined for a life of service.
She came from a family with a political background out in southwestern PA.
Throughout high school, Evie was active in a range of activities, including band, sports, and student government. She carried a strong work ethic from adolescence into adulthood, running for local office in 1983.
She was elected clerk of courts in Beaver County in the mid-'80s. Eventually, she came to the Harrisburg area, and after she was here, after she met Mr. Henderson, she tried to run for office in Dauphin County.
No-nonsense Evelyn found a lifelong ally and supporter in Carmen. The pair married in 1991, and Carmen's good reputation bolstered Evelyn's political confidence.
She made several bids for office. She came from Beaver County, and she thought that her experience and accolades and her past status as an elected official out there would instantly transfer over. That was a rude awakening when she came here and realized all of a sudden, no, you're an outsider.
After a slew of lost elections, Evelyn and Carmen decided to pivot their energy into opening a business.
So, I'm just going to give me a limousine. That's what I'll do. I'll just get me a limousine and start my own profession.
He did most of the work for the cars, so he was able to save a lot of money that way. Evelyn ran the day-to-day part of the booking the trips and getting clients.
They literally had the monopoly on limousines at one point, and I can only imagine, how proud he was of a business that he built.
But by 2022, the business had lost much of its revenue due to Carmen's failing health.
Mr. Henderson's health had been declining to some extent. He was becoming more frail. He was 84 years old, wasn't able to walk as easily as he used to.
Mr. Carmen was just, getting older. They were still getting some income in, but it just slowly faded away.
But now, Carmen has been found burned to death in his own backyard, and police are desperate for answers.
Evelyn, she now acts kind of surprised, basically saying he caught himself on fire. He was a cigar smoker.
Evelyn told us that he likes to smoke cigars out back, and he will sometimes light the wrappers on fire. So at one point she said maybe he set himself on fire because he was burning the wrappers.
Her demeanor was described as strange. You would expect someone to be hysterically crying and upset and inconsolable, and she was just flat and had just a monotone reaction to everything.
One possibility would be that she's simply in shock from what has occurred and what she witnessed.
I mean, what's a normal reaction to have to your husband being burned alive? There is no uniform normal reaction.
Evelyn's bizarre response, combined with the circumstances of Carmen's death and the state of the home, bolster detectives' sense of urgency.
We treat every suspicious death as a homicide until proven otherwise. So I knew we were going to have to get a search warrant for the house. I knew we were going to have to remove her from the house in order to perform the search warrant to secure the scene, make sure nothing gets tampered with. I took a closer look. Inside the house was absolutely deplorable. It was filthy. There was rotted food, plates just sitting haphazardly. It was squalor.
Coming up, a search warrant provides strange clues.
People don't burn as bad as Mr. Henderson does without accelerant.
And an interview with Evelyn compounds the mystery.
It happened yesterday
What happened?
when he caught himself on fire.
Pennsylvania police are investigating the bizarre death of a former officer, 84-year-old Carmen Henderson. His wife, Evelyn Zigerelli Henderson, thinks he caught himself on fire. But given the neglected state of their home, detectives wonder about her mental state.
One of the first things that we look at in terms of how well people are doing mentally is how well do they take care of themselves. If they're out of touch with reality or even just severely emotionally distressed, that can be reflected in what surrounds them. Sometimes a place filled with clutter and that is not clean and has all sorts of indications of mental illness.
We asked her, when did you see him last? She said, last night he went out to smoke a cigar around 7 or 8 o'clock, and I went to bed. And then she said that she didn't see him until she woke up this morning and called 911.
Evelyn originally said she saw Carmen around 1 a.m.
Evelyn is confusing details, and when you're getting different pieces of information like Evelyn is giving here, police are certainly going to be concerned about whether or not Evelyn is a reliable source of information.
She had indicated that she was bipolar and she had stopped taking her medication.
The characteristic bipolar disorder is cyclical mood swings from periods of elation to periods of depression. This can affect memory and cause a person to become confused, and that sometimes doesn't allow that person to perceive what's going on in the world in front of them.
So I said to her, would you mind coming with us to the police station to talk? And she said, absolutely.
As Evelyn is transported to the Susquehanna Township Police Station, investigators search for other potential witnesses.
Law enforcement canvasses the neighborhood. They want to talk to neighbors and see if anyone saw or heard anything.
No one reported hearing any yelling, any screaming.
This was June, so it could be, that people had air conditioners in their windows. It could be the time of night it happened. Maybe everyone was in a deep sleep.
At first glance, the scene itself doesn't provide many answers either.
You could immediately see that he had no clothing on, and he was burned severely from head to toe.
My question is, why is he naked?
When you looked on the ground, there was actually a pile of debris, burned debris, everything charred. There were shoes, parts of a belt, a cuff of a shirt. And so the more you kind of looked at the scene, the more it became apparent that he actually was dressed when he caught fire.
We believed as he was on fire, he more than likely was disrobing.
The severity of the burns raises other questions.
The initial thought is there must have been some sort of accelerant, some kind of liquid, flammable liquid that would have been poured onto him, either by himself or somebody else, that would have ignited to cause those kind of burns.
People don't burn as bad as Mr. Henderson does without accelerant.
There are no nearby accelerants Carmen could have used when igniting the fire.
We actually brought a dog, an arson dog, to the scene. The dog ran through the scene and came back as not indicating that they detected any form of accelerant.
But the one thing the dogs don't hit on is alcohol, because it's common to homes. So just because the dog didn't hit on anything, that doesn't mean that there wasn't accelerant used. Now, there was ignition source on the table. We found a lighter. And also, very strange, we found a paper towel that was rolled up and burnt at one end, almost as if it was used like some people will use it to start pilot lights or something like that. So this did not look accidental at all.
Closer inspection of the patio reveals another clue.
There was a blue chair kind of off to the left as you walk out of the house, and then there was another chair that was a gray chair, like a folding camping chair, that was turned on its side on the ground over near the wall. The gray chair was involved in the fire. It clearly had been burned.
And the back portion that you would lean against, that was completely burned away. But the arms, the seat of the chair, and the footrest were not burned at all.
But the most important piece of evidence comes from Carmen's body.
I looked closely at his face. A lot of times when someone is alive, when they're burning, you'll see soot on the nose as they're breathing in the soot. But what I found was fly larvae. Fly larvae is generally about 24 hours after time of death. So that told me immediately that the story Evelyn told the 911 dispatcher was a complete lie. Because there's no way, with a short amount of time, could flies have landed on the body and left their eggs behind.
They definitely think that something sinister has happened to him. This is probably one of the worst ways that somebody could die.
So did she not remember because of her mental illness? Or is it deception? Either way, it appears impossible that Carmen lit himself on fire.
Over 3 hours after Evelyn Henderson called 911, investigators are now seriously questioning her account of her husband's death. When they sit down with her at the police station, they ask her to go over the details of that evening again.
Her demeanor is relatively the same as it is on the scene. You know, she doesn't get upset, she is not crying, she doesn't seem like she's grieving.
It did not seem like she was in any sort of shock from the incident at that point. That seemed like it may have been the case on the scene, but now we're hours later. She's removed from the scene, and she's clearly understanding the questions.
So what happened that we're here today? Can you explain that to me?
Well, I called 911 because Carmen Henderson needed help.
I'm trying to get her into a story that's consistent that she's staying with.
On the scene, her version was that the last time she saw Mr. Henderson was at 7 o'clock at night, and then she went to bed and didn't see him again till the morning. Then when she was talking to Sergeant Wilson, the time changed to 11 o'clock at night.
I said, Evelyn, didn't happen. There's fly larvae in his mouth and nose. I said, that takes at least 24 hours to develop.
It happened yesterday.
What?
Yesterday.
What happened yesterday?
When he caught himself on fire.
Okay, so now walk us through that, because now we're talking about a whole different timeline now.
When someone is not giving proper sequencing, it could be due to deception, but it could also be due to a number of other factors, including trauma.
Unable to put Evelyn in a consistent timeline, they changed tactics.
When they asked her, did you go outside to the back patio? You know, she indicates, yes, I went outside.
Well, when I come to the door, it was already on fire. But I was not up there when it first happened.
And that was about what time?
I don't know, I guess it was 4 or 5 o'clock. I come back in to call 911, and I did. He screamed for me. He's like, come out back. He was on fire.
So what did he scream?
He was just screaming my name. Evie.
Evie.
He fell down, he stopped talking, and she just went about her day until at approximately 5:30 in the morning. Evelyn Henderson dialed 911.
Investigators are stunned to realize that at least 4 hours would have passed before Evelyn finally called police.
When she told me that, I knew I was truly in the presence of evil. Some people make mistakes, some people do bad things, but she, at that moment, struck me as truly an evil person.
I mean, how long do you think you looked at him before you called 911?
15 minutes.
So you looked at him for 15 minutes?
10 minutes. No, it was less than that.
Okay. How long do you think it was?
5 minutes.
She knows she should have called. She saw him go down, but she just didn't.
She had no good answer for why she waited to call 911. And of course, it's hard to come up with in your mind when you're trying to think, why would anyone wait?
Could she have been having a mental health issue? Possible. Absolutely could be possible. But how she was telling the story, it just felt to me that it almost felt like it was more of a controlled act as opposed to a person with a mental illness. I felt she was involved, but we didn't even have anything concrete at that point.
The interview continues for several more hours as police try to determine whether Evelyn had a reason to murder Carmen.
She talks about their relationship as being kind of up and down, that it was good for a long time, but in recent memory that they had been arguing.
That's what we were arguing about. Money. What were we arguing about money for? She goes, he doesn't know where all the money went, and he was blaming me for losing the business.
Evelyn admits she mismanaged the finances of the couple's limousine company, overspending on luxuries.
The spending on her part, the not being able to manage money, is what kind of put them under.
She said that she knew that they're going to lose the house. They were $40,000 in debt on a second mortgage. They stopped making payments on it.
She was worried about losing the home or not having a place to stay.
She admitted at some point that there's a $10,000 life insurance on him.
Evelyn said over and over again that she did not do this, that he lit himself on fire. She kept saying that repeatedly.
I said, look, Evelyn, I said, nothing's making sense. I said, you know what? I said, I think it's going to point back to you, Evelyn.
Coming up, Carmen's loved ones share disturbing stories about Evelyn.
That crazy B.I.G.C.H. She effing did it.
But can investigators prove she committed murder?
He was actually breathing in more flames than any sort of smoke. It's excruciatingly painful being burned.
After a 7-hour interrogation, detectives are convinced Evelyn Henderson is the one responsible for her husband's gruesome death.
At that point, based on her changing stories, not having an accurate timeline of events, and all of the evidence on scene, the decision was made to charge.
The charges the district attorney told us to go with was aggravated arson, which is arson committed during the course of a felony. The felony would be the homicide.
Evelyn is transported to Pennsylvania's Dauphin County Jail, while authorities continue to build a case against her. They believe personal testimonials and forensic evidence will help earn a conviction.
We certainly had probable cause at that moment to believe that she had committed this crime and the charges we had charged her with, but there were things that still needed to be done.
To learn more about the relationship between Evelyn and Carmen, investigators reach out to family and friends later that same day.
We get a phone call from the police saying your father was killed in an accident.
They were saying that he was set on fire. I said, how can that be?
They said it's going to be treated as a homicide. So we're like, well, who did it? And they said, we arrested your dad's wife. I'm like, that crazy B.I.G.C.H. She effing did it.
According to Carmen's loved ones, the problems in the marriage had nothing to do with his treatment of Evelyn.
My dad gave her everything. Everything you think of. Trips, cars, clothes, jewelry. He did everything that she wanted to do.
But she didn't seem appreciative of his efforts.
They said Evelyn was rude to them, was mean to them, treated Mr. Henderson like garbage.
She didn't want us in the house because of the things that she was probably doing to my father, and he wouldn't tell us. In order for my dad to stay happy, we just didn't go around because it seemed to upset her if we would come over there to see him.
They say Evelyn's behavior seemed to grow worse over time.
She would really just didn't have any type of people skills. So she would belittle people, she would be nasty to people.
People that worked for the limousine company said she was mean and degrading and never had a kind word to say about anyone. She presented herself that she was better than them and everyone was below her. She had this air that she was like royalty.
Evelyn was known to have some outbursts of anger and even yelling at strangers sometimes. And we know that people who've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder often engage in that very same behavior.
Once Carmen's age forced him to retire, it left Evelyn completely in charge of the business and Carmen's failing health.
He couldn't do all the work that he could do on the cars. And Evelyn seemed to have more episodes. And when she was having episodes, she was also losing business.
She was such a mean, horrible, evil person. A lot of people boycotted my dad's business. They used to tell my dad all the time, you need to leave her, because they saw something too in her that he didn't see.
He never ever complained about how she would scream and holler, how she would cuss or anything. He loved her. So I just didn't understand what happened. Why would you kill somebody that loved you so much?
We suspected, just from everything that we knew, that she may have grown tired of having to care for him, since he was elderly and was not able to do everything for himself as time went on. That was something that put a larger burden on her.
I truly believe she was waiting for him to die, and he wouldn't die. And in her evil heart, she decided that's how she was going to get more money out of him for the last time.
However, police still need direct evidence she killed Carmen. And there are viable theories to the contrary.
I believe in Occam's razor, right? Which the most simplest explanation is probably the correct one. Carmen was a known cigar smoker. He was an elderly gentleman with some physical limitations who was on oxygen. I'm just not convinced that she did it. Some people have said that she suffered from some type or types of mental illness. But I don't necessarily think that that translates to somebody becoming a murderer.
The autopsy still needed to be conducted here, and then the fire investigators had to complete their investigation as well. After somebody is charged and or arrested, that's really only the beginning of the investigation.
Five days after Carmen Henderson's burned body was found on his porch, a forensic pathologist performs an autopsy.
The toxicology results for Carmen Henderson were not exactly what you would expect to see in a case if someone dies from a fire. Oftentimes, the thing that kills them is inhaling all of the smoke. His blood results did not bear that out. Dr. Rost was able to figure that he was alive when he was burned. The one sure indicator of that was that there was some soot that was ultimately found in his throat area. This was a fire that caught quickly, burned hot, and so there wouldn't have been a lot of smoke initially, and so he was actually breathing in more flames than any sort of smoke.
Another huge thing that was found was that a majority of the worst burns were on his back, which indicated that that would have been where the fire had started.
That triggered additional conversations talking about, could it have still been accidental? How could this happen where the fire essentially starts behind him if it's accidental? Looking at how cigars burn and how they can set clothing on fire, it just became more and more rock solid that there's no way he could have set himself on fire. Everything in the autopsy was consistent with this being a homicide.
Based on the evidence, investigators believe Carmen was sitting in his deck chair when the fire began.
The seat of the chair had almost no fire damage to it, but the upper part of the chair was completely burned away. That was something that was consistent with him being lit on fire from behind.
Police obviously want to go and talk to Evelyn and confront her with this information because it does not align up with any of the stories that she has given to this point. The interview is done the same day as the autopsy.
We drive to the Dauphin County Prison, asked to have her brought to an interview room. I said, Evelyn, look, you're the only person that was there. And I said, you and I both know you set him on fire. It was the longest pause of my life. And she goes, I did it.
She indicated that Carmen was sitting outside on the back patio in the chair. He had his back towards the house. Then she snuck up behind him and lit the back of the chair on fire, and that his clothes became engulfed in flames, and that he had called out, Evie, Evie, help me, as he burned and as she watched him burn.
Those are chilling details, you know, setting somebody on fire. That's not like shooting somebody from a distance. It's a very personal thing, and it's excruciatingly painful being burned. She really didn't give a reason why she had done this, but her giving the confession and then talking through the details of how she did it in a way that was totally consistent with what we knew from the physical evidence, it's validation of what you concluded happened.
With Evelyn's confession, prosecutors believe they have an open and shut murder case. But at the first pretrial hearing, she once again changes her story.
By the time the preliminary hearing rolled around, she was denying that she did the crime. She basically recanted her confession. So the case wasn't over yet at that point, and the investigation wasn't over.
If Evelyn's confession is determined to be inadmissible, prosecutors must have evidence to prove she set Carmen's chair on fire and that it burned quickly enough to kill him before he could escape the flames.
The biggest thing we had left to do was to conduct an experiment that showed this chair could be lit on fire without the use of accelerants.
The decision was made to take portions of the chair that we had in evidence and actually test them, do live testing on them to see if they were flammable and how fast they would be engulfed in flames.
I naturally assume that if you're making a product that people use while camping, it's going to be at least flame resistant. Well, we found out later that camping chairs burn like solid rocket fuel.
Detectives conclude the chair was incinerated within a matter of seconds.
Obviously, he's an elderly male. We know that he has mobility issues, trouble getting around.
By the time he is able to react, his clothing is now on fire. He gets up, is frantically moving around, which knocks the chair over, gets his clothes off the best he can to try to get away from the flames. But by then, it's too late.
He didn't fall asleep in his favorite chair and die. He was murdered, and he was burnt to death. 100%, that's what the evidence proves.
The only remaining question is whether a jury will believe the evidence or Evelyn.
Evelyn Henderson's attorneys contended that Evelyn had been offered bipolar medication and had made a false confession to setting the fire.
On March 12, 2024, nearly 2 years after Carmen Henderson burned to death, his wife, Evelyn Zigerelli Henderson, goes on trial for his murder.
My opening statement, I started it out essentially with what Carmen's last words likely would have been, which was, Evie, help me. And I just kind of cried that out to the jury 5 or 6 times to really get them to understand the impact of how awful of a death this was.
The crux of the defense at trial was essentially to say that Evelyn Henderson gave a false confession, and that the only reason she said she did it was because she had given up, as the defense put it.
In many of these homicide cases, there is an element of mental health.
The defense in this case certainly brought up that she was bipolar, which really the only evidence of that was she had indicated that she had stopped taking her medication.
The claims of her being bipolar came from her and her alone. There was never any extrinsic evidence provided to us about that.
The defense argues that the fire was simply an accident.
Evelyn Henderson's attorneys also argued that Carmen Henderson set the fire himself during their closing arguments.
Going into deliberations, we just hoped that the jury followed the evidence.
The jury's verdict in this case was very interesting. They convicted her of second-degree murder, which is felony murder in Pennsylvania. That verdict kind of indicates that the jury didn't think that she meant to kill Carmen Henderson, but believed that she set the fire.
The day that she was convicted, there was something that I had in my mind, a surprise for her.
Sheriff Chimeni leaned over to me. He goes, "You know those handcuffs that she's wearing?" I said, "Yeah. Those are Carmen's."
I asked Evelyn, how did those handcuffs fit? I said, "These were your husband's handcuffs." Her reaction, her eyes kind of opened up and it kind of hit her.
At Evelyn's sentencing hearing, Carmen's friends and family are given the opportunity to tell her how her actions affected them.
I told her that if Mr. Carmen had survived the incident, he would come in in bandages and all and be trying to convince the jury that she didn't mean it. He would forgive her. And I told her, that's the man you took from everyone.
When I did the impact about how could you treat someone like that was so kind to you and loved you and gave you everything, that's when she broke. That was the first time she ever looked up and you could see in her eyes that she did it and that maybe she regretted it.
Evelyn is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
It was relief that we had gotten some justice for Carmen and for his family and that they would be able to put this portion behind them. That's a very small portion of the grief that they'll have to go through for the rest of their lives.
I don't know why my dad didn't see it. How could love overshadow something that evil?
I want everybody to know that he was happy, always willing to help everybody, sociable, and best swimmer ever.
Everyone that you meet has something good to say about Dad. And that kept us going, that we loved him and a lot of other people loved him.
I wish everybody got a chance to be around him, and I wish he was here right now.
It is 5:23 a.m. in Susquehanna Township, Pennsylvania, and the world outside is still wrapped in that strange half-light between night and morning. The kind of silence that feels almost artificial, as if even sound itself is waiting for something to happen. Inside a modest suburban home, a phone rings. Not the kind of ring that brings routine news or casual conversation. This one carries weight before it is even answered. When dispatch picks up the call, the voice on the other end is female, steady in a way that immediately stands out. Not frantic, not breaking, just certain. She says her husband is dead. The operator pauses, fingers already moving across a keyboard, trying to anchor the situation into something understandable. Name, address, confirmation. But the caller doesn't adjust her tone. She repeats it in different words, as if reinforcing a fact already decided in her mind. He didn't make it. He's gone. He's deceased. The operator asks the obvious question, the one trained into every response protocol. How do you know? There is a pause on the line. Then the answer comes, almost detached from emotion. I just know. Outside, the first unit is already being dispatched. When Corporal Alex Wagner arrives at the address, he notices immediately that nothing about the scene matches the urgency of a death investigation. No visible chaos. No neighbors outside. No flashing lights of panic. Just a quiet house sitting under a dim, gray morning sky. The front door is opened by a woman who introduces herself as Evelyn. She does not cry. She does not rush toward him. Instead, she gestures vaguely toward the back of the house and says, "My husband is out there. He's dead." Even before stepping inside, something in her delivery registers as unusual, not false, not rehearsed, just emotionally flat in a way that doesn't align with what she is describing. The officer moves through the house, down a short hallway, toward the back exit. Each step brings a subtle shift in atmosphere. The air grows heavier, warmer. Wrong. When he opens the back door, the scene outside changes everything. A stone patio stretches into a small backyard. Neat, ordinary, suburban. But on that patio, collapsed and motionless, is the body of an elderly man. He is completely naked, and he is burned beyond recognition. The officer stops for a moment that later he will struggle to describe. Not because he doesn't understand what he is seeing, but because the human brain resists accepting it as real. The shape on the ground is still a person, but fire has rewritten everything familiar about him. Backup is called immediately. The scene is secured. The quiet suburban morning is replaced with radios, urgency, and the controlled chaos of a death investigation beginning in real time. Inside the perimeter, detectives arrive and begin the slow process of observing what cannot yet be explained. The body shows severe burns from head to toe, with the most extensive damage concentrated on the back. That detail matters. It changes the direction of every early assumption, because it suggests position. It suggests contact. It suggests sequence. Nearby, there are scattered remnants of clothing, partially burned and separated, as if removed during or after the fire. Shoes. Fabric fragments. A belt buckle warped by heat. Everything tells a fragmented story that refuses to align cleanly. And then there is the question no one can avoid asking, even if no one says it aloud at first. How does someone end up like this in their own backyard without anyone noticing until morning? The wife remains inside the house. Evelyn Henderson is not behaving like most people expect in this situation. There is no collapse into grief. No visible shock waves. Instead, she answers questions in short, controlled sentences. She repeats that her husband liked to smoke cigars outside, that he used to burn the wrappers, that sometimes he would sit out back at night with oxygen nearby. Each detail sounds ordinary on its own. Together, they begin to form something investigators are cautious about accepting too quickly. Because early explanations are dangerous in cases like this. The simplest answer is often the most seductive one. Accident. Smoking. Oxygen. Fire. But something about the scene resists simplicity. The burns are too extensive. The circumstances too unclear. The position of the body too inconsistent with a calm, accidental ignition. And most of all, the timeline described by the wife does not settle neatly into place. She says she saw him at night. She says she went to sleep. She says she found him in the morning. But when pressed for detail, the sequence shifts slightly. A time changes here. A moment blurs there. Not enough to accuse, but enough to notice. Outside, investigators continue documenting the patio. The air smells faintly metallic beneath the usual scent of burned material. There is no obvious accelerant odor, no obvious container, nothing that immediately explains how a fire of this intensity could begin and spread so completely. And yet the fire did happen. That much is undeniable. What remains uncertain is everything else. Who lit it? Why it burned so intensely? And whether the man on the ground had any ability to escape it once it began. As the scene expands, so does the number of questions. The victim is identified as Carmen Q. Henderson, an 84-year-old former police officer. A man with decades of public service behind him. Someone neighbors remember not as a distant figure, but as a presence. A man who once wore a uniform. A man who once worked cases of his own. A man who, in a different life, might have been the one standing on the other side of this scene. That detail changes the emotional weight of everything immediately, because now this is not just an unidentified tragedy. It is someone who is known, respected, recognized. And that makes the silence around his death even louder. As detectives begin to reconstruct the earliest timeline, they find themselves pulled between two competing interpretations. On one side, an accident that escalated beyond control. A cigarette, a cigar, oxygen, a moment of misjudgment in the dark. On the other side, something far more disturbing. A staged scene, a controlled ignition, a death that may have occurred before the fire ever began. At first, there is no evidence strong enough to fully commit to either theory. But there is something else. The house itself. Inside, it does not reflect the image of a stable, orderly environment. It is cluttered in a way that draws attention. Not just messy, but neglected. Objects piled without structure. Surfaces that suggest long periods without attention. Food left out. Items scattered. A sense of decay that feels out of step with the calm suburban exterior. Investigators note it quietly at first, not as proof of anything, but as context, because environment often mirrors condition, mental, emotional, or otherwise. Evelyn mentions that she has been struggling, that she has been off medication, that her moods have been unpredictable. These are not confessions. They are fragments of explanation, offered without prompting, as if she is trying to assemble a version of reality that fits what has already happened. Still, nothing is confirmed. Not yet. Outside, the body remains the center of attention. Forensic teams move carefully, documenting burn patterns, positioning, and physical evidence. One observation stands out early. The severity of the burns does not immediately align with what investigators would expect from a simple accidental ignition. The fire behaved aggressively.
Quickly.
Almost efficiently. There is also the unsettling question of clothing. Why is he naked? Some of the fabric remnants suggest he may have been wearing clothes at the time the fire began, which would imply movement, struggle, or disorientation as the flames intensified. Not a passive collapse. Something more dynamic. And then there is the back. The most severely burned area is located there. That detail does not go unnoticed. Because in fire investigations, pattern matters. Direction matters. Origin matters. The question begins to shift from what happened to how it started. As daylight strengthens, the scene becomes more controlled, more procedural. But the emotional weight does not diminish. Officers rotate through, each reacting differently upon seeing the body. Some fall silent. Others look away too quickly. Even experienced personnel hesitate at the edge of the patio, as if crossing an invisible boundary. Inside the house, Evelyn remains available for questioning. She repeats her account. She insists on the cigar explanation. She insists she saw nothing unusual. She insists she went to sleep and woke up to something already irreversible. But investigators are no longer simply listening for consistency. They're listening for structure, for narrative stability, for the difference between memory and reconstruction. Because something about this case suggests that those two things may not align. And as the morning continues, one conclusion begins to form quietly among the investigators working the scene. This is not a simple accident waiting to be confirmed. It is a death surrounded by uncertainty, contradiction, and timing that refuses to settle. And in cases like this, uncertainty is never neutral. It always points somewhere. The only question is where. To understand what was lost on that bus that night, investigators and later the public had to step away from the chaos of the highway and return to the quiet, ordinary shape of a life that had been moving forward just hours before it was erased. Tim McLean was not a headline before July 30th, 2008. He was not a figure of public attention or controversy. He was a young man defined by motion, by work that took him across cities and provinces, by the kind of employment that exists on the edges of permanence, where people build temporary communities around fairgrounds and carnival lots, then dissolve them and move on again. Those who knew him described a person who fit easily into that rhythm, someone who did not resist instability because instability was all he had known for years. He worked as a carnival laborer, setting up rides, assembling structures, performing the physical tasks that made entertainment possible for strangers who would never know his name. It was hard work, often exhausting, but it offered something he seemed to accept naturally: freedom without roots, movement without confinement. In photographs taken before his death, Tim appears relaxed in a way that suggests someone not burdened by expectations beyond the immediate. There is no sense of impending tragedy in those images, no visible tension in his expression. He is simply a young man among others, part of a workforce that exists in seasonal cycles, traveling from one location to another as fares rise and disappear like temporary cities. His family life, unlike his work, was anchored in familiarity. He maintained contact with his mother and relatives, returning home between jobs whenever possible. Those who spoke about him afterward emphasized not dramatic achievements, but consistency of character. He was dependable in the way young adults can be when they're still forming their long-term identity. Someone who showed up when expected, who communicated with family, who made plans in a straightforward manner without layering them in complexity. There was no indication in his background of violent tendencies or high-risk behavior. He was not involved in criminal activity. He did not have a public record that would suggest vulnerability to targeted harm. In the structure of his life, nothing pointed toward the kind of random, extreme violence that would later define the final moment of his existence. That absence of warning is part of what continues to unsettle those who study the case. His decision to board the Greyhound bus that evening was routine. Long-distance buses in Canada serve as connective tissue between distant communities, carrying people who cannot or do not travel by air or private vehicle. The passengers are often strangers to each other, temporarily sharing a confined space with a shared destination but no shared identity. Tim fit into that environment without friction. He boarded, found a seat, placed himself near the window, and settled into the familiar structure of travel. His belongings were minimal, consistent with someone used to living out of bags and duffel containers. He wore headphones, a detail that would later be repeated in witness accounts because it emphasized his separation from the environment around him. Music created a private layer of experience, insulating him from conversation and ambient noise. It is a common behavior among travelers, but in retrospect it becomes an emotional detail that sharpens the sense of isolation. The bus itself was unremarkable. Greyhound routes across Manitoba are long, often passing through stretches of highway where the landscape becomes repetitive, fields dissolving into darkness at night, punctuated only by roadside lights or distant silhouettes of trees. Inside, passengers settle into patterns of stillness. Some sleep, some stare out into the dark, some remain alert but disengaged. It is a transitional environment, neither public in the way a city street is public, nor private in the way a home is private. It exists somewhere between states, which is part of what made the events of that night so difficult for witnesses to process afterward. Tim's position near the back of the bus placed him among other passengers who were similarly absorbed in their own silence. There was nothing unusual in his placement, nothing that suggested vulnerability or attention. To anyone observing casually, he was simply another traveler. The man seated beside him, Vince Lee, did not disrupt that perception. He did not engage in conversation or behavior that drew notice. Later accounts struggled to reconstruct his demeanor because it left so little impression. This lack of distinctiveness is not unusual in public transportation settings, but in the context of what followed, it became one of the most disturbing elements of a case. It is often difficult for the human mind to reconcile extreme violence with prior normality, especially when that normality is defined by invisibility rather than warning signs. Tim's life, when examined in retrospect, does not present any clear narrative of impending tragedy. There were no documented conflicts that pointed toward him as a target. No known disputes followed him onto the bus. No indication that he was being followed or observed in a threatening way. This absence of context is important because it reinforces the randomness of what occurred, a randomness that challenges the way people attempt to assign meaning to violent events. As the bus continued its route through Manitoba, Tim remained in a state of partial awareness, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, music isolating him further from the external environment. That state of reduced perception is common during long travel, especially at night, when the body naturally begins to shut down its alert systems. The human brain, in such conditions, prioritizes rest over vigilance, assuming safety based on environmental stability. Inside a moving bus, that assumption is usually correct. Nothing about the conditions suggested otherwise. The temperature, the lighting, the steady rhythm of movement all reinforced a sense of predictable continuity. Tim's final hours were therefore not marked by fear or anticipation, but by ordinary fatigue. He was a young man returning from work, nearing the end of a journey that should have ended uneventfully. The contrast between this normality and what followed is one of the most psychologically difficult aspects of the case for those who study it. It raises questions not only about vulnerability in public spaces, but about the limits of perception itself, about how human beings construct a sense of safety in environments shared with strangers. On that night, Tim was part of a system that depends entirely on trust between unknown individuals. Every passenger on that bus was, in a sense, relying on the assumption that others would behave within socially expected boundaries. That assumption is rarely questioned because it is reinforced by countless uneventful journeys. The bus had likely completed thousands of trips without incident before that night. Tim had likely taken similar transportation before without issue. Nothing in his experience would have suggested that this particular journey would end differently. His personal history does not contain dramatic foreshadowing. It contains instead the ordinary structure of a young adult building a life through temporary work, maintaining family connections, moving between jobs, and adapting to the instability of seasonal employment. In many ways, his life reflected a broader reality of young workers in labor-intensive industries, where mobility is not a choice but a requirement. The tragedy of his death is intensified by the fact that it interrupted a trajectory that was still unfolding. There was no completed arc to reflect upon, no resolved narrative. Only continuation that was abruptly cut off in a moment that neither he nor those around him could have anticipated. When investigators later reconstructed his presence on the bus, they focused not on speculation but on the physical and behavioral facts available: his seat location, his belongings, his posture, the condition of his personal items. These details helped establish a timeline, but they did not provide emotional explanation. They could not answer why he was there in that exact moment of time and space when violence erupted around him. That question, ultimately, remained beyond the reach of forensic science. What remained instead was the recognition that Tim McLean was a young man engaged in a routine act of travel, one that millions of people undertake without incident every year. His story, prior to the attack, is defined not by complexity, but by normality. And it is precisely that normality that makes his absence so difficult to comprehend. The moment the violence began on the Greyhound bus, time stopped behaving in a way any of the passengers could later explain. Those who were awake would describe it afterward not as a sequence of actions, but as a rupture, something that tore through the normal flow of reality so quickly that the mind could not process it in real time. There was no argument that escalated, no visible warning, no emotional buildup that could be retrospectively identified as a precursor. Instead, there was only an abrupt shift from ordinary silence to something unrecognizable, as if the world had been rewritten in a single instant. Tim McLean had been in a state of partial rest, headphones still on, his awareness divided between music and fatigue. In environments like long-distance buses, passengers often develop a fragile sense of safety, reinforced by repetition and routine. The seats, the hum of the engine, the predictable stops all contribute to a subconscious belief that nothing extraordinary will happen because nothing ever does. That belief is what made what followed so difficult for witnesses to reconcile. There was no transition period. The attack did not build. It simply happened. The first reactions inside the bus were not coherent responses, but fragments of confusion. Some passengers initially believed there had been a physical altercation, something that might resolve quickly or be contained. Others froze, unable to interpret what they were seeing because their brains refused to assign meaning to it. In enclosed public spaces, human beings rely on shared cues to interpret danger, but those cues were absent here. There was no shouting match, no struggle for control, no indication of mutual conflict. There was only one individual acting with sustained and incomprehensible intent, and another who had been completely unprepared for what was happening. Within seconds, the interior of the bus shifted from a place of passive travel into an environment of panic. People began to move instinctively toward the front, away from the source of violence, their movements disorganized and driven by fear rather than coordination. The aisle became a channel of urgency, bodies pushing forward, voices rising in overlapping confusion. The driver, upon realizing that something catastrophic was unfolding behind him, reacted by bringing the vehicle to a stop along the highway shoulder. The decision was not calculated but instinctive, driven by the necessity of removing as many passengers as possible from immediate danger. When the doors opened, passengers spilled out into the night air, some running several meters away before stopping, others turning back toward the bus in disbelief, unable to detach themselves from what they had just witnessed. The rural darkness surrounding the highway made the scene even more surreal. There were no nearby buildings, no immediate shelter, only open land and the faint glow of emergency lights as people began to realize that help would not arrive instantly. The outside world felt both safer and more uncertain because the danger had not been neutralized, only contained within a metal vehicle now sitting motionless on the roadside. Inside the bus, the situation continued in a way that defied immediate comprehension. Those who remained outside could see movement through the windows, but the details were fragmented, obscured by reflections, distance, and psychological shock. Human perception under extreme stress tends to distort clarity, replacing it with symbolic impressions rather than accurate visual reconstruction. Witnesses later struggled to describe exactly what they saw, often resorting to broken phrases or incomplete memories, because the brain resists fully encoding experiences that violate its sense of order. Emergency services were called within moments, but the rural location meant that response time would not be immediate. That gap between awareness and intervention became one of the most psychologically intense aspects of the incident for those present. They were forced into a passive observational role, aware that something irreversible was occurring but unable to intervene safely. The bus, illuminated intermittently by passing headlights and emergency signals, became a sealed environment of uncertainty, a space where normal rules of accessibility no longer applied. When law enforcement units began to arrive, the scene expanded from a single vehicle into a controlled perimeter. Officers positioned themselves around the bus, assessing risk and attempting to determine the safest approach. At this stage, information remained incomplete. They knew there had been a violent attack, but they did not yet fully understand the condition of the individuals inside or the exact nature of the threat. In such situations, protocol requires caution because immediate entry into an unstable environment can escalate danger unpredictably. Inside the bus, Vince Lee remained present. His behavior during this period would later be described as detached from the emotional intensity that defined the external response. While the outside world had shifted into emergency mode, his internal state appeared unresponsive to the chaos surrounding him. This disconnect between internal cognition and external perception became a central point of investigation later, as experts tried to understand how an individual could operate within such a framework of dissociation from immediate consequences. As officers established communication attempts, the bus itself became a focal point of tactical uncertainty. Every window represented both visibility and vulnerability. Every movement inside had to be interpreted without full context. The psychological tension extended beyond the physical scene into the minds of responders, who were required to maintain control while processing information that defied standard criminal behavior patterns. Outside, the passengers who had escaped gathered in small groups, some sitting on the ground, others standing motionless, staring at the bus as if waiting for it to change into something else. Many of them were in states of shock that prevented coherent communication. Emergency personnel began triaging not only physical needs, but psychological distress, recognizing that the trauma experienced in those minutes would have long-term consequences for those who witnessed it. The highway itself became temporarily inaccessible, traffic diverted, space redefined by emergency boundaries. The rural silence that had previously characterized the night was replaced by the layered sounds of radios, footsteps, and distant sirens approaching from multiple directions. Yet despite this influx of activity, the core situation remained confined to the bus, where the resolution of the immediate threat was still uncertain. Negotiation attempts were limited by the nature of the situation. There was no clear communication channel, no predictable behavioral pattern to engage with, and no established framework that could guarantee compliance or de-escalation. The priority shifted toward containment rather than resolution, ensuring that the situation did not expand beyond the vehicle or create additional casualties. Time became both an ally and an obstacle, stretching forward in a way that intensified anticipation while delaying closure. Inside the bus, the internal environment continued to evolve in ways that remained partially obscured until later forensic reconstruction. The lighting, the confined space, and the absence of external reference points created a setting where perception was distorted. For those outside, Every moment felt extended beyond normal duration, each second carrying disproportionate weight because of uncertainty about what was still occurring within. Eventually, after a prolonged standoff characterized by controlled positioning and careful observation, Vince Lee exited the bus. His movement toward the outside space marked the end of the immediate crisis phase, though it did not resolve the emotional or investigative consequences of what had taken place. He was taken into custody without physical resistance, a transition that contrasted sharply with the intensity of the earlier events. When the doors of the bus were finally fully accessible to investigators, the scene inside required immediate forensic attention. The interior had become a complex environment of evidence, trauma, and disrupted normality. Every surface, every seat, every object within the space carried potential relevance to understanding the sequence of events. The challenge for investigators was not only to document what had happened, but to reconstruct a coherent narrative from fragmented physical and psychological traces. What made this incident particularly difficult to process in its immediate aftermath was the absence of any conventional explanatory framework. There had been no robbery, no interpersonal conflict between known individuals, no environmental trigger that could easily contextualize the violence. Instead, there was only a sudden, isolated eruption of lethal behavior in a setting designed for public transportation and safety. As emergency personnel secured the scene and forensic teams prepared to begin their detailed examination, the broader implications of the incident had not yet fully emerged. At that moment, it was still understood primarily as a singular act of extreme violence on a bus. Only later would it expand into a case study that would challenge assumptions about mental health, public vulnerability, and the unpredictable intersections between ordinary environments and extraordinary human behavior. For those who had been present, however, the analytical layer came much later. In the immediate hours following the incident, there was only shock, fragmentation of memory, and the struggle to understand something that had unfolded too quickly to fully comprehend. The bus remained on the roadside as dawn approached, its presence now marked not by transportation, but by the irreversible transformation of a routine journey into one of the most disturbing episodes of modern Canadian criminal history. When the first responding officers reached the Greyhound bus on that stretch of highway in Manitoba, the scene they encountered did not fit neatly into any category they had been trained to handle. It was not just a crime scene in the traditional sense, and it was not merely a medical emergency that had already resolved itself. It existed in an in-between state, suspended between violence and aftermath, where the boundary between what had happened and what was still unfolding felt dangerously thin. The bus sat on the roadside under intermittent emergency lighting, its interior partially visible through windows that reflected the glare of patrol vehicles. From the outside, it looked almost ordinary, like a vehicle that had simply stopped for mechanical reasons. But that illusion collapsed the moment officers approached and saw the inside more clearly. The confined space of the bus had been transformed into something unrecognizable, a sealed environment where the normal order of travel had been violently interrupted and replaced with something far more disturbing. The first officer to step closer later described a sense of cognitive delay, a moment where perception and understanding failed to synchronize. What the eyes saw did not immediately translate into meaning. The human brain expects violence to occur in certain contexts, in certain places, with certain preconditions. A public bus on a rural highway is not one of those expected contexts. That mismatch created a psychological hesitation that had to be overcome before procedural thinking could take over. Inside the bus, Tim McLean's body was discovered in a condition that immediately confirmed the severity of the incident. The confined nature of the space meant that every detail was amplified, every surface holding traces of what had occurred. The aisle, the seats, the floor, all carried evidence that could not be ignored or abstracted away. There was no separation between victim and environment. Everything was part of the same collapsed moment of violence. Officers quickly secured the perimeter, not because there was active movement inside, but because protocol required absolute certainty that no further threat remained. In situations involving unpredictable behavior, caution becomes the dominant principle. Even after initial visual confirmation, the uncertainty of what might still be occurring inside the vehicle demanded restraint. As backup units arrived, the highway itself became a controlled zone. Traffic was redirected, and the surrounding darkness was punctuated by flashing lights that stretched across the flat landscape. The isolation of the location intensified the sense of unreality. There were no buildings nearby, no urban noise, only the open prairie absorbing the sound of engines and radios. It felt removed from normal geography, as if the incident had occurred in a space temporarily detached from the rest of the world. The passengers who had managed to escape the bus were gathered at a distance, some seated on the ground, others standing in small clusters. Their reactions varied widely, but all shared a common state of shock. Some were silent, staring toward the bus, as if waiting for further confirmation that what they had seen was real. Others were attempting to communicate with dispatchers or family members, their voices unstable, fragmented, unable to form complete narratives. Emergency personnel moved between them, assessing physical condition and psychological distress. While few had sustained physical injuries, the mental impact was immediate and severe. Witnessing extreme violence in such a confined and inescapable environment creates a form of trauma that does not resolve with distance alone. The image remains fixed, resistant to time, replaying in memory, without the ability to be edited or softened. Inside the bus, investigators began the early stages of scene documentation. This process required careful control of movement and attention to detail because every object had potential evidentiary significance. The positioning of seats, the condition of personal belongings, and the distribution of physical traces all contributed to reconstructing the sequence of events. In violent incidents occurring in confined spaces, spatial relationships become critical. The bus was not just a location, it was a narrative structure in physical form. One of the first observations made by investigators was the absence of any signs that would normally precede a struggle between two individuals engaged in mutual conflict. There were no indications of prolonged confrontation, no evidence of negotiation or escalation between two parties. Instead, the physical environment suggested a sudden and overwhelming disruption, one that unfolded within a very short time frame. The challenge at this stage was not only forensic but interpretive. Investigators had to avoid premature conclusions while still forming hypotheses that could guide further examination. In cases involving extreme violence, early assumptions can distort the investigative trajectory. Therefore, every detail had to be recorded without immediate narrative framing. Outside the bus, law enforcement established a broader command structure. Communication lines were opened between local police, provincial authorities, and specialized investigative units. The coordination of resources reflected the seriousness of the incident, even before full details were confirmed. Situations involving mass trauma in public transportation settings are rare, and each one requires rapid adaptation of standard procedures. As the initial containment phase stabilized, attention shifted toward identifying the individuals involved and reconstructing their movements prior to the incident. Witness statements were collected in structured interviews designed to minimize memory contamination. However, even in these early accounts, it was clear that the psychological impact of what had occurred was profound. Many witnesses struggled to maintain chronological order in their recollections, instead describing emotional impressions rather than precise sequences. The interior of the bus itself became the central focus of forensic attention. Every surface was examined for trace evidence, every object catalogued in relation to its position. The confined nature of the space meant that reconstruction would depend heavily on spatial mapping. Unlike outdoor crime scenes, where environmental factors can disperse evidence, the enclosed environment preserved a compressed record of events, intensifying both clarity and complexity. One of the most striking aspects noted by investigators was how quickly the environment had transitioned from normal use to catastrophic disruption. The bus had been functioning as a routine transportation vehicle only moments before. There was no external damage to suggest a collision or accident. The transformation was entirely internal, driven by human action rather than environmental force. As the investigation progressed through these initial hours, attention inevitably turned toward the individual responsible for the violence. Vince Lee, who had been taken into custody, was separated from the immediate scene for questioning and evaluation. However, at this stage, The priority remained the preservation of the crime scene and the stabilization of all witnesses. What made this phase particularly complex was the lack of a clear behavioral framework for understanding the actions that had taken place. Investigators were confronted with a situation that did not conform to typical criminal patterns involving motive, escalation, and resolution. Instead, they were dealing with a sequence that appeared abrupt, isolated, and structurally fragmented. The environment outside the bus continued to evolve as daylight began to approach. The transition from night to early morning added a new layer of visual clarity, revealing details that had previously been obscured by darkness. The flat landscape of Manitoba, once only visible in outlines, now became fully present, making the contrast between the ordinary setting and the extraordinary event even more pronounced. By the time the initial forensic phase was well underway, it had become clear that this incident would require extended investigation far beyond the immediate response period. The bus was not simply a location to be cleared and returned to service. It had become a repository of evidence, memory, and unanswered questions. For those who had been present, both responders and passengers, the experience marked a permanent division in perception. There was life before the bus stopped, and life after. The investigation would continue to unfold over months and years, but the moment of discovery on that roadside in Manitoba remained fixed as the point where an ordinary journey had transformed into one of the most disturbing and complex crime scenes in modern Canadian history. In the hours and days following the discovery on the highway near Portage La Prairie, the investigation into Tim McLean's death began to shift from immediate response into something far more complex and uncertain. What initially appeared to be a straightforward act of extreme violence inside a confined space quickly expanded into a case filled with contradictions, fragmented perceptions, and psychological questions that could not be answered by physical evidence alone. The bus, once secured as a crime scene, now represented only the starting point of an inquiry that had to extend outward into the life of the suspect, the mental state of those involved, and the sequence of decisions that led to that moment on the roadside. At the center of this expanding investigation was Vince Lee, a man who, in the immediate aftermath, did not present investigators with a coherent narrative of intent or motive in the way most violent offenders typically do. When officers and forensic psychologists began assembling preliminary profiles, they were confronted with a pattern that did not align with standard behavioral expectations. There was no clear indication of interpersonal conflict between him and the victim prior to the incident, no known prior connection, and no documented escalation of hostility during the journey itself. This absence of relational context forced investigators to broaden their focus beyond conventional frameworks of motive. The first step was reconstructing Lee's movements before boarding the bus. Surveillance records, ticket information, and witness accounts from earlier stops were reviewed to establish a timeline. What emerged was a picture of a man who had traveled alone, interacting minimally with others, appearing quiet and detached. There was nothing in his outward behavior that suggested imminent violence, which made the later events even more difficult to reconcile. In most criminal investigations, early indicators often exist in subtle behavioral shifts, but here, those indicators were either absent or not recognized at the time. As investigators expanded their scope, attention turned toward mental health history, a component that would become central to understanding the case. Information began to surface that Vince Lee had a documented history of psychiatric illness, specifically symptoms consistent with schizophrenia. This detail significantly altered the direction of the investigation because it introduced the possibility that the actions on the bus were not rooted in conventional criminal intent, but in a distorted perception of reality. However, establishing a mental health diagnosis was only one part of the challenge. Investigators also had to determine how that condition may have influenced behavior in the critical moments before and during the attack. This required consultation with forensic psychiatrists who began reviewing available records and conducting retrospective analyses. They examined patterns of thought, reported delusions, and prior episodes of disorientation. What they found suggested a long-standing struggle with severe psychiatric instability, including hallucinations and impaired reality testing. At the same time, investigators were careful not to allow medical explanations to prematurely replace evidentiary analysis. The legal system requires a distinction between understanding behavior and excusing it, and this distinction became a central tension throughout the case. While mental illness could explain altered perception, it did not automatically clarify the sequence of actions that took place on the bus. Parallel to the psychological evaluation, forensic teams continued their detailed examination of the bus itself. Every object inside was cataloged, photographed, and analyzed for trace evidence. The confined nature of the environment meant that even minor details could carry significant weight. The position of seats, the distribution of personal belongings, and the pattern of disturbances within the interior space were all used to reconstruct movement and timing. One of the key challenges during this phase was establishing a precise timeline of events. Witness accounts provided external perspective, but internal reconstruction relied heavily on physical evidence. The absence of continuous surveillance meant that investigators had to piece together a sequence from fragmented observations. This process required careful calibration, as memory under trauma is often inconsistent and physical evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on context. As the investigation deepened, attention also turned to the behavior of the suspect immediately after the incident. Vinsley's lack of escape attempt and his passive response to law enforcement raised additional questions for behavioral analysts. In most violent incidents, perpetrators either flee, attempt concealment, or exhibit continued aggression. Here, however, the behavior did not conform to those patterns, suggesting a psychological state that did not align with conventional criminal intent frameworks. This discrepancy led investigators to explore the possibility of a psychotic episode during the incident itself. Forensic psychiatrists examined whether the actions could have been driven by delusional beliefs, particularly those involving misidentification or perceived external commands. While such conditions can produce extreme behavior, establishing their presence at the exact moment of the incident required careful analysis of both medical history and post-incident statements. At the same time, investigators also considered alternative hypotheses, including the possibility of intentional violence without psychological impairment. This dual-track approach was necessary to avoid prematurely narrowing the scope of inquiry. In complex cases involving ambiguous mental states, multiple interpretations must remain open until evidence clearly supports one over others. As interviews with witnesses from the bus were compiled and cross-referenced, patterns began to emerge in how the event was perceived externally. Many passengers described a sense of unreality, a feeling that what they were witnessing could not be fully integrated into normal experience. This psychological response, while not evidentiary in a legal sense, provided insight into the intensity and suddenness of the event. Investigators also began reconstructing the environmental conditions inside the bus at the time of the incident. Lighting, seating arrangement, and spatial constraints all played a role in how events unfolded. The confined nature of the space meant that movement was restricted and visibility limited, which influenced both the victim's ability to respond and the witness's ability to fully understand what was happening in real time. As the investigation progressed, the focus gradually shifted from immediate reconstruction to broader questions of causation. What combination of factors led to this specific individual committing such an act in this specific environment? Was it a convergence of mental illness, situational opportunity, and environmental isolation, or was there a more direct and singular explanation rooted in intent? This question became central because it would ultimately determine how the case was classified within the legal system. If the actions were deemed to be the result of severe mental illness affecting cognitive control, the legal consequences would differ significantly from those assigned to premeditated violence. Therefore, every piece of evidence had to be evaluated not only for what it showed, but for what it implied about mental state and decision-making capacity. As days turned into weeks, the investigative process became increasingly multidisciplinary. Law enforcement officers worked alongside forensic psychologists, psychiatrists, and physical evidence analysts, each contributing a different layer of interpretation. The complexity of the case required constant reassessment, as new findings often challenged earlier assumptions. Despite the accumulation of data, one element remained consistently difficult to define with certainty: the internal experience of the suspect during the incident. While external actions could be reconstructed with reasonable accuracy, internal cognition could only be inferred. This gap between observable behavior and subjective mental state represented one of the most significant challenges in the entire investigation. By the end of this phase, investigators had developed a working framework that combined physical evidence, witness testimony, and psychiatric evaluation. However, it was still not a complete explanation. It was a structured interpretation of events rather than a definitive narrative. The case remained open to legal and psychological interpretation, with key questions still unresolved at the level of intent, awareness, and responsibility. What had begun as a sudden and incomprehensible act of violence on a bus was now transforming into a complex intersection of criminal investigation and mental health analysis. And as the investigation moved forward, it became increasingly clear that the answers would not be found in a single domain, but in the difficult space where law, psychology, and human behavior overlap without clear boundaries. As the investigation into the Greyhound bus incident progressed beyond its initial shock phase, the case reached a point where physical evidence alone was no longer sufficient to explain what had happened. The forensic reconstruction of the scene had already established the sequence of violence with relative clarity, but the deeper question that now dominated the investigation was no longer about what occurred, but why it occurred in the way it did. This shift marked the beginning of the breakthrough phase, where psychological interpretation and legal classification began to converge under increasing pressure. The central focus remained Vince Lee, whose behavior before, during, and after the incident continued to defy simple categorization. Early interviews, witness accounts, and travel records had established a pattern of isolation and minimal interaction, but these elements alone could not account for the severity and suddenness of the violence. Investigators were now forced to examine the possibility that the most critical evidence was not physical, but internal, residing in the fractured mental state of the suspect at the time of the event. It was during this stage that psychiatric evaluations became decisive. Forensic psychiatrists conducting retrospective assessments began to identify patterns consistent with acute psychosis, particularly symptoms involving delusional misinterpretation of reality. According to medical analysis, individuals experiencing such episodes may perceive external threats where none exist, or assign symbolic meaning to strangers and environments based on internal hallucinations rather than objective reality. In Lee's case, these interpretations began to align with the fragmented statements he would later provide, in which he described experiencing distorted perceptions and perceived commands that did not correspond to external reality. However, what transformed this psychological assessment into a breakthrough was not the diagnosis itself, but its alignment with physical evidence from the bus. Investigators had already documented the absence of prior conflict between the victim and the suspect, the lack of any discernible motive in conventional terms, and the rapid escalation of violence without warning. When these elements were re-examined through the lens of psychosis, a new interpretive framework began to emerge, one in which the violence was not the result of interpersonal dynamics, but of internal cognitive collapse. This reinterpretation did not resolve the case, but it fundamentally altered its trajectory. It shifted the investigative focus from behavioral intent to cognitive impairment, from motive to perception. In practical terms, this meant that legal responsibility could no longer be evaluated solely through external actions, but had to consider the internal state of awareness at the moment of the offense. This was a critical turning point because it introduced the possibility that the suspect may not have been operating under recognizable criminal intent at all. As psychiatric findings were integrated into the broader case file, investigators began to reconstruct a more detailed timeline of Lee's mental state leading up to the incident. Medical history revealed prior episodes of psychotic symptoms, including auditory hallucinations and delusional beliefs that had previously required treatment. While these records did not predict the specific event on the bus, they provided context for understanding how a severe episode could manifest under conditions of isolation and stress. At the same time, forensic analysts continued refining the physical reconstruction of the bus interior. One of the most significant findings during this phase was the absence of any indicators suggesting prolonged interaction or negotiation between the two individuals involved. The spatial analysis confirmed that the attack occurred rapidly and within a confined area, consistent with a sudden psychological break rather than a staged confrontation. This reinforced the emerging psychiatric interpretation, as the physical environment showed no evidence of escalation that would typically accompany intentional interpersonal violence. Witness testimony, when reevaluated in light of these findings, also began to take on new significance. Many passengers had described the suspect's behavior as detached or emotionally flat immediately following the incident. While such observations are inherently subjective, they became more meaningful when considered alongside psychiatric evaluations suggesting impaired emotional processing. The convergence of behavioral observation and clinical assessment strengthened the argument that the suspect's mental state was profoundly altered during the event. Despite this emerging framework, investigators remained cautious. The legal system required more than psychological plausibility. It required demonstrable connection between mental state and specific actions. To address this, forensic psychiatrists conducted structured reconstructions of the likely cognitive processes occurring during the incident. These reconstructions suggested that the suspect may have been operating under a delusional system in which external stimuli were misinterpreted as threats requiring immediate defensive action. While this explanation did not diminish the severity of the outcome, it provided a mechanism for understanding how such behavior could occur without conventional intent. The breakthrough became more concrete when these psychiatric interpretations were compared with the suspect's own post-incident statements. Although fragmented and inconsistent, his descriptions included references to perceived external control and distorted reality perception. While such statements cannot be taken at face value without corroboration, their consistency with clinical findings added weight to the hypothesis of acute psychosis during the incident. At this stage, investigators faced a critical decision point. The case could be pursued under traditional homicide frameworks, emphasizing intent and culpability, or it could be redirected toward a legal structure that accounted for diminished criminal responsibility due to mental illness. This distinction carried profound implications not only for prosecution strategy, but also for public interpretation of the case. The breakthrough was not a single piece of evidence, but the convergence of multiple independent lines of analysis, forensic reconstruction, psychiatric evaluation, and behavioral observation, all pointing toward a shared conclusion that the suspect's cognitive state during the incident was fundamentally compromised. This convergence did not eliminate ambiguity, but it narrowed the range of plausible interpretations significantly. As this framework solidified, prosecutors and investigators began preparing for a legal argument centered on criminal responsibility rather than purely criminal intent. This required careful balancing, as the evidence clearly demonstrated a fatal act of violence, but the psychological context introduced complexity into how that act should be legally classified. Behind the scenes, discussions intensified around how to present the case in court. Expert testimony would need to explain not only what happened on the bus, but how mental illness could intersect with behavior in such a way that traditional models of intent might not fully apply. This required translating complex psychiatric findings into language that could be understood within a legal context without oversimplifying or misrepresenting their meaning. For the families involved, this phase of the investigation was particularly difficult because it introduced uncertainty into what had initially appeared to be a straightforward case of wrongful death. The idea that mental illness might play a central role did not reduce the tragedy, but it complicated the search for meaning and accountability in ways that were emotionally challenging to process. Nevertheless, from an investigative standpoint, the breakthrough represented a critical evolution in understanding. It provided a coherent framework that integrated previously disconnected elements of the case into a unified interpretation. The violence on the bus was no longer seen as an isolated anomaly, but as the outcome of a specific psychological condition interacting with an uncontrolled environment. By the end of this phase, the investigation had moved from confusion towards structured explanation. It had not reached closure, but it had established the foundation upon which legal proceedings would be built. The question was no longer whether the event had occurred or who was responsible in a physical sense. The question had become how responsibility should be defined when perception itself is compromised. This shift marked the true turning point in the case, transforming it from a criminal investigation into a broader examination of human cognition, responsibility, and the fragile boundary between intention and impairment. The courtroom in Dauphin County felt colder than it should have, even with the heating systems working overtime against a Pennsylvania winter that refused to let go. Outside, the world was ordinary in the most unsettling way possible. Cars passed. People went to work. Life continued without hesitation. But inside those walls, every detail seemed suspended, as if time itself had slowed down to make space for something unbearable to be examined piece by piece. Evelyn Zigerelli Henderson sat at the defense table in silence, her hands folded in front of her. There was nothing dramatic about her posture. No visible trembling, no theatrical collapse. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that made people in the courtroom unsure of what they were supposed to feel when they looked at her. Across from her, the prosecution team organized stacks of evidence that had been built over months of investigation. Each page, each photograph, each report representing a fragment of the final hours of Carmen Henderson's life. When the trial officially began in March 2024, the atmosphere was already heavy with expectation. This was not a case that needed to be understood in abstract terms. Everyone already knew what had happened. A man had been found burned to death on his own patio. His wife had been the only other person present in the house. And somewhere between accident, illness, and intent, the truth had to be located and defined in a way that the law could recognize. The prosecution opened with a narrative that did not rely on shock or exaggeration. Instead, they built Carmen Henderson back into existence for the jury. Not as a victim in a photograph, but as a man who had lived a long, structured life filled with service, discipline, and routine. They spoke about his years in law enforcement, his reputation in the community, the way neighbors described him as steady and kind, someone who had spent decades helping others maintain order in their lives. As they spoke, images were projected in the courtroom, not of the crime scene, but of life before it. Smiling photographs, family moments, a man standing beside people who clearly trusted him. Then the tone shifted. The evidence began to reconstruct the night of his death in a way that removed all ambiguity. The timeline was presented carefully. The arrival of evening. The movement of both individuals inside the house. The eventual separation as Carmen went outside to the back patio, a habit he reportedly had for smoking cigars despite his declining health. The prosecution did not rush this part. They allowed silence between facts, as if giving the jury time to feel the weight of what was coming. When the moment of ignition was described, the courtroom did not react loudly, but something subtle changed in the air. The prosecution suggested that Carmen Henderson was seated when the fire began, his back closest to the source of ignition. This detail mattered more than any emotional appeal. It shaped the entire structure of intent. A fire starting behind someone is not random in the same way as a dropped cigarette or an accidental spark. It suggests placement, direction, choice. The defense, however, worked to destabilize that certainty from the very beginning. They did not deny the death, nor the severity of it. Instead, they focused on the fragility of interpretation. Evelyn Henderson's mental health became a central axis of their argument. They described cycles of instability, confusion, and medication noncompliance. They presented her not as a calculating actor, but as someone whose perception of reality could shift under pressure, especially during moments of emotional or psychological distress. In their version of events, what happened that night could not be separated from impairment. The inconsistencies in her statements were not, they argued, signs of deception but signs of a fractured memory under trauma. The defense suggested that expecting a perfectly coherent timeline from someone who had witnessed a horrific incident was itself an unrealistic standard. But the prosecution countered this carefully. They did not attack her mental health directly. Instead, they focused on structure. They showed how her accounts changed in measurable ways. Not just small inconsistencies, but shifts that altered the entire sequence of events. The time she last saw her husband. The moment she went outside. The delay before calling emergency services. Each variation, when placed side by side, created a pattern that was difficult to dismiss as confusion alone. One of the most critical moments in the trial came when the emergency call itself was played for the jury. The courtroom listened to Evelyn Henderson's voice as she tried to explain what had happened. There was no visible breakdown in her tone, no audible hysteria, just a steady, almost detached delivery of information. She stated that Carmen was dead. She stated that she knew this without certainty being confirmed. She stated that she had seen him earlier in the night and had chosen not to call for help immediately. The prosecution paused the playback at several points, allowing jurors to absorb the weight of each sentence. It was not what she said alone that mattered, but how it contrasted with what would be expected in such a moment. The absence of urgency became its own form of evidence. As testimony continued over the following days, forensic experts took the stand to explain the physical reality of what had been discovered on the patio. They described burn patterns, positioning, and the condition of surrounding objects. The chair became a focal point, not as an object of furniture, but as a piece of reconstructed sequence. The way it had burned suggested rapid ignition. The distribution of damage suggested proximity and direction rather than random spread. These were not abstract conclusions, but interpretations grounded in physical residue. The defense attempted to introduce alternative explanations. They returned repeatedly to the possibility of accident, emphasizing Carmen Henderson's cigar use and his mobility issues. They suggested that in a compromised physical state, even a small mistake could escalate rapidly. But each attempt to reframe the event ran into the same structural obstacle. The speed and intensity of the fire did not behave like a slow, accidental ignition. Witnesses from the investigation described the scene again in court, but now with the structure of legal scrutiny shaping their words. The burned patio, the absence of widespread ignition points, the condition of the body. Every detail became part of a reconstructed puzzle that the jury had to assemble mentally while sitting in silence. One of the most difficult moments for the jury came when they were shown the extent of Carmen Henderson's injuries. Not in a sensationalized way, but through clinical description and forensic imaging. The prosecution emphasized that he was alive during the initial phase of burning. That realization shifted the emotional weight of the trial dramatically. This was no longer just about how he died, but about the experience of that death. Throughout the proceedings, Evelyn Henderson remained largely unchanged in demeanor. She did not interrupt. She did not react visibly to testimony. For some observers, this was interpreted as emotional suppression. For others, it reinforced the defense's argument of psychological detachment or dissociation. The ambiguity of her behavior became one of the most contested aspects of the entire trial. As closing arguments approached, both sides faced the challenge of summarizing a case that resisted simple categorization. The prosecution emphasized convergence. Every piece of evidence, they argued, pointed in the same direction. The physical evidence, the timeline inconsistencies, the delayed emergency response, and the eventual confession all formed a coherent structure when viewed together. They told the jury that uncertainty should not be mistaken for innocence when the pattern of evidence consistently aligned. The defense, in contrast, focused on doubt. They asked the jury to consider the limits of certainty when dealing with trauma, mental illness, and imperfect memory. They argued that a life sentence required more than inference. It required proof that eliminated all reasonable alternative explanations. When deliberation began, the courtroom emptied slowly, but the tension did not leave with it. Families waited outside. Reporters gathered. Legal teams reviewed their notes again and again, knowing that the verdict would define not only the outcome of this case, but also how similar cases might be understood in the future. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom stood as the foreperson delivered the verdict. Evelyn Zigerelli Henderson was found guilty of second-degree murder, classified under felony murder provisions in Pennsylvania law. The legal interpretation did not explicitly require proof of intent to kill, but rather that a death occurred during the commission of a dangerous felony act. The decision reflected a nuanced position. The jury did not fully endorse the idea of calculated intent in the traditional sense, but they also rejected the explanation of accident. The moment the verdict was read, Evelyn Henderson did not visibly react. Her expression remained controlled, almost unchanged. But across the room, the reaction was immediate and fragmented. Some members of the victim's family broke into tears. Others sat in silence, absorbing the reality that legal closure had finally arrived after years of waiting. Sentencing followed shortly after. The court imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. When the judge spoke, the language was measured but firm, acknowledging both the severity of the crime and the complexity of the circumstances that had been presented during the trial. As Evelyn Henderson was led away, there was no dramatic exit. No final statement that echoed through the room. Just the sound of movement, the closing of procedural order, and the quiet realization that a chapter of the case had ended. But outside the courthouse, the story did not feel finished for many people. The verdict answered legal questions, but it did not erase the emotional ones. How does a long shared life end in such destruction? How does familiarity transform into something unrecognizable? And how do those left behind reconcile the image of a man they loved with the manner of his death? The courtroom had done its job. It had translated chaos into structure and suspicion into judgment. But the weight of what had happened in that backyard remained outside the reach of law, sitting instead in memory, grief, and the uncomfortable silence that follows when explanation is not the same as understanding. After the courtroom emptied and the doors closed behind the last reporters, what remained was not resolution in the emotional sense, but a quiet restructuring of reality for everyone connected to Carmen Henderson. A legal outcome had been delivered, recorded, and sealed into the official history of the case, yet the human aftermath continued to unfold in ways that no verdict could fully contain. For the family of Carmen Henderson, the days following sentencing were not marked by relief so much as by exhaustion. The trial had forced them to revisit moments they would never have chosen to relive, reconstructing the final hours of a man they had known not as a victim in a file, but as a father, a grandfather, and a constant presence in their lives. The courtroom had turned his death into a sequence of evidentiary points, but in their private conversations it remained something far less structured and far more difficult to process. It was not a puzzle to be solved anymore. It was an absence that had permanently reshaped their daily existence. They spoke often about memory, about how it now felt unreliable in places it had never been before. Small recollections of Carmen Henderson sitting at a table, telling a story, or working on something in the garage, suddenly carried a different weight. These memories did not change, but their meaning did. Everything now existed in a timeline that ended abruptly on a stone patio, and that knowledge altered even the most ordinary recollections of him. For investigators and legal professionals, the case gradually transitioned into the category of something concluded, but never fully settled in conversation. It was often referenced not for its procedural complexity, but for the way it blurred lines that criminal law typically prefers to keep distinct. Accident versus intent. Illness versus responsibility. Perception versus reality. These were not abstract legal theories in this case, but competing frameworks that had each felt plausible at different stages of the investigation. What made the case linger in professional memory was not uncertainty about the verdict, but the way it forced uncomfortable reflection on how behavior is interpreted through the lens of mental health. Evelyn Henderson's psychological history had become a central point of debate, not only during trial but in broader discussions among clinicians, legal scholars, and law enforcement professionals who followed the case. Her actions, her inconsistencies, and her eventual confession were repeatedly analyzed through multiple interpretive models, none of which fully resolved the tension between clinical explanation and legal accountability. Within correctional and psychiatric systems, the case also became part of ongoing discussions about how individuals deemed not fully criminally responsible are managed over time. The structure of treatment, supervision, and eventual reintegration is designed to balance public safety with medical rehabilitation, but cases like this one expose how difficult it is to predict long-term risk or behavioral stability with certainty. Even when clinical improvement is documented, the public memory of the original act often remains fixed, resistant to revision. For the broader public, the case gradually faded from immediate attention, as most cases do, but it did not disappear from collective memory in the same way ordinary crimes might. Instead, it settled into a category of incidents that resurface periodically whenever discussions about mental illness and violent crime return to public discourse. Each time it was referenced, It brought with it the same uneasy questions that had surrounded it from the beginning, questions that did not have satisfying or universal answers. Could someone act under psychological impairment and still be fully understood by the legal system? Where does accountability begin when perception of reality is fundamentally altered? And perhaps most persistently, how should society balance compassion for mental illness with the irreversible consequences of violent acts committed under its influence? Carmen Henderson's life, meanwhile, continued to be remembered in a way that resisted being reduced to the circumstances of his death. Those who knew him spoke less about how he died and more about how he lived. They returned to stories of his work in law enforcement, his presence in the community, and the consistency of his character over decades of public service. In these recollections, he was not defined by the final moment of his life, but by the accumulation of years that preceded it. There is often a tendency in violent cases for the narrative to collapse entirely into the moment of death, as if everything that came before is merely context for an ending. But for those closest to Carmen Henderson, that framing felt incomplete. His life was not an introduction to a tragedy. It was a full and extended story that deserved to remain intact even after it had been violently interrupted. The physical site of the incident, the backyard patio, also carried a lingering presence in the minds of those who had worked the case. For investigators, returning to that location, even after the forensic work was complete, brought a sense of repetition that never fully became routine. Crime scenes involving fire carry a particular kind of visual memory, where physical structures are not just damaged but fundamentally transformed. What once was familiar becomes something stripped of its original identity, leaving behind a version of reality that feels partially erased. Over time, the legal documents and forensic reports became static records, but the human interpretations of the case continued to evolve. Some professionals reflected on whether earlier intervention in mental health treatment might have altered the trajectory of events. Others focused on procedural questions about emergency response timing and the interpretation of inconsistent witness statements under stress. These discussions rarely produced consensus, but they demonstrated that the case continued to function as a reference point for unresolved systemic questions. For Evelyn Henderson herself, now serving a life sentence without parole, the outside world became something distant and increasingly abstract. Within the correctional system, her identity was no longer defined by the narrative of the trial, but by institutional classification and ongoing evaluation. Over time, cases like hers become part of a broader administrative structure that prioritizes risk assessment, treatment compliance, and behavioral observation over public narrative. Yet the original act remains the defining reference point for every decision made about custody and care. What remains most difficult about this case is not the clarity of what happened in a legal sense, but the emotional contradiction it leaves behind. The law required a conclusion, and it delivered one. The evidence required interpretation, and it received one. But human understanding resists finality in a way legal systems are not designed to accommodate. People continue to ask how such a death could occur within the context of an otherwise ordinary domestic environment, how long-term relationships can contain such instability without external visibility, and how quickly life can shift from routine to irreversible destruction. In the end, what this case leaves behind is not just a record of events, but a set of questions that continue to echo beyond the courtroom. It forces reflection on how society defines responsibility when perception itself becomes unreliable, and how justice is shaped not only by facts but by the limits of what those facts can explain. For Carmen Henderson's family, the passage of time will not resolve the central absence created by that night. It will only change the way that absence is carried. For investigators, it remains one of those rare cases that is technically concluded but intellectually unsettled. And for anyone who encounters the story, it serves as a reminder that behind every legal file is a reality far more complex than any single explanation can contain. Long after the trial ended and the case file was archived into the legal history of Dauphin County, what lingered was not the procedural outcome, but the uneasy space between understanding and acceptance. People like to believe that once a verdict is delivered, a kind of emotional order follows, that the world rebalances itself in response to justice being formally recognized. But cases like this resist that kind of closure. They leave behind a structure of facts that can be legally resolved while remaining emotionally unresolved for everyone who touches them. For those who lived closest to Carmen Henderson, time did not move in a straight line after his death. It bent around certain moments, especially the image of a backyard patio on a quiet morning that should have been ordinary. The memory of that space became permanently altered, no longer just part of a home, but a place where something irreversible had occurred. Even long after the investigation ended, that mental image would surface unexpectedly in the middle of otherwise normal days, interrupting conversations, meals, and sleep with the same sense of disbelief that had first accompanied the news. Grief in this case did not behave in a conventional way. It did not follow a predictable cycle of shock, anger, and acceptance. Instead, it returned in waves triggered by unrelated moments, sometimes by something as simple as the sound of a phone ringing early in the morning or the smell of smoke in the air. For the family, these were not abstract psychological reactions, but lived experiences that reshaped how they moved through the world. Life became a series of adjustments around an absence that could not be integrated into any sense of normality. Meanwhile, the broader public memory of the case settled into a quieter but persistent presence. It was not constantly discussed, but it resurfaced whenever conversations turned toward mental illness, domestic tragedy, or the limits of legal responsibility. Each time it reappeared, it brought with it the same discomforting duality. On one hand, there was a clear legal narrative, a conviction, a sentencing, and a formal acknowledgement of guilt within the framework of felony murder. On the other hand, there remained an unresolved psychological dimension that refused to align neatly with the language of criminal intent. This tension is what keeps cases like this alive in public discourse long after media attention fades. They become reference points not because they are the most sensational, but because they expose structural questions that do not have universally satisfying answers. When someone's mental state is part of the causal chain of violence, the legal system is forced to operate in a space where clarity and ambiguity coexist uneasily. That is not a failure of the system so much as a reflection of the complexity of human behavior itself. Within professional circles, especially among those working in forensic psychology and criminal justice, the case is often remembered for how it challenged assumptions about predictability. It highlighted the difficulty of distinguishing between genuine cognitive disorientation and constructed narratives that may emerge after the fact. It also reinforced how critical it is for investigators to rely on physical evidence when subjective accounts become inconsistent, not because those accounts are inherently unreliable, but because trauma, fear, and mental illness can distort perception in ways that are not always immediately visible. For correctional and mental health systems, the long-term handling of individuals involved in cases like this raises ongoing ethical and practical questions. Risk assessment is never static, and decisions about supervision, treatment, and reintegration are always made with incomplete information about future behavior. Even when clinical improvement is observed, the original act remains a fixed point against which all subsequent evaluations are measured. This creates a constant tension between rehabilitation as a goal and public safety as a requirement. But perhaps the most difficult aspect of this case is not found in legal doctrine or forensic analysis. It is found in the human contradiction at its center. Carmen Henderson was described by everyone who knew him as stable, generous, and deeply embedded in the life of his community. Evelyn Henderson, in contrast, was described through a fragmented lens of instability, financial stress, and psychological volatility. Yet they shared the same space, the same routines, the same final environment in which everything collapsed. That coexistence of normalcy and rupture is what makes the case so difficult to fully comprehend even after every fact has been established. There is a tendency when looking at tragedies like this to search for a singular explanation, a defining moment or cause that can neatly account for everything that followed. But the reality is often more layered. Financial strain, aging, mental health struggles, interpersonal tension, and environmental stressors can accumulate without visible rupture until a critical threshold is crossed. The law must eventually simplify these complexities into verdicts and charges, but human understanding does not always follow the same path. In the years after the sentencing, Carmen Henderson's name continued to appear in conversations about community history and law enforcement legacy. Not as a victim defined by the manner of his death, but as a man whose life had spanned decades of service and personal connection. His identity, in that sense, resisted being reduced to the final event that ended it. Those who remembered him most clearly often returned to earlier memories, ones that existed long before the incident that brought his name into public legal records. For Evelyn Henderson, the consequences of that single morning extend into a life confined by institutional boundaries, where time is measured differently and identity is shaped by classification rather than personal history. Whatever internal reality accompanied her actions that night remains contained within a system that can observe behavior but cannot fully reconstruct subjective experience. That gap between external observation and internal perception is one of the enduring challenges in understanding cases involving mental illness and violent outcomes. Ultimately, what remains after everything has been examined, tested, argued, and judged is not a complete explanation but a structured record of what was known at the time. The legal system provides closure in the form of verdicts, but human understanding continues to move beyond them, revisiting the same questions in different forms, searching for coherence in a situation that resists simplification. The case of Carmen Henderson does not offer a final lesson so much as it offers a sustained reflection on fragility. The fragility of perception, of relationships, of mental stability, and of the assumption that ordinary life is immune to sudden and irreversible rupture. It reminds us that even in environments that appear stable and familiar, unseen pressures can accumulate until they manifest in ways that leave behind only questions that cannot be fully answered. And so, long after the legal system has spoken, the story does not truly end. It continues instead in memory, in discussion, and in the quiet, persistent effort to understand how something so ordinary in appearance could become something so permanently devastating in outcome. In the months and years following the conclusion of the case, the physical spaces connected to Carmen Henderson's final moments slowly returned to the rhythms of ordinary life. The backyard where the incident occurred no longer carried visible traces of the event, yet for those who knew what had happened there, it remained permanently altered in perception. A place does not need to retain physical evidence of violence to continue holding its emotional weight. Sometimes the absence of visible signs only makes the memory more intrusive because the mind fills in what the eyes can no longer confirm. For neighbors and those living nearby, life gradually resumed its normal cadence. Lawns were cut, seasons changed, and new routines replaced the brief disruption that had once drawn police vehicles and investigators into the area. Yet even among those who were not personally connected to the individuals involved, there was a lingering awareness that something irreversible had occurred behind closed doors and on that patio. In small communities especially, events like this become part of local memory, not as active conversation but as quiet reference points that shape how people perceive the fragility of everyday stability. Within Carmen Henderson's extended family, remembrance became a structured form of continuity. Anniversaries of his death were marked not through public ceremony, but through private acknowledgement. These moments were less about revisiting the details of what happened and more about affirming that his life extended far beyond its final hour. Stories about him continued to circulate, often repeated with slight variations, not because accuracy was in question, but because repetition itself served as a way of preserving presence. In telling and retelling, he remained part of the present tense in their lives, even as the legal system had long since categorized his death as a closed case. Evelyn Henderson's presence in public discourse diminished significantly after sentencing, as is typical once a case moves fully into the correctional system. Yet her name would occasionally resurface in discussions about criminal responsibility, mental health law, and the boundaries of culpability. These conversations often revealed how cases like this become symbolic rather than purely factual. People use them to argue broader philosophical positions about justice, illness, and intent, sometimes without fully engaging with the specific human realities at the center of the case. One of the most persistent tensions in how the case is remembered lies in its dual identity as both a domestic tragedy and a forensic investigation. On one level, It is the story of a long-term relationship that ended in irreversible violence under deeply contested circumstances. On another level, it is a structured legal case built from forensic evidence, witness testimony, and psychological evaluation. These two frameworks coexist, but do not fully align, and that misalignment is part of why the case continues to provoke reflection long after its conclusion. In professional environments, particularly among those studying criminal behavior and forensic psychology, the case is often referenced in discussions about how mental illness intersects with violent outcomes. It is not treated as an example that provides definitive answers, but rather as one that highlights limitations in predictive models. Human behavior, especially under psychological distress, does not always follow patterns that can be easily anticipated or categorized. This unpredictability complicates efforts to design systems that can prevent similar tragedies, because prevention depends on identifying risk before it becomes action. At the same time, the case also reinforces the importance of physical evidence in reconstructing events where subjective accounts are inconsistent or incomplete. The forensic findings played a decisive role in shaping the final legal interpretation, demonstrating how material reality can provide structure in situations where human memory and perception diverge. Yet, even this structure does not eliminate ambiguity entirely. It simply narrows the range of plausible explanations to those that can be supported by observable data. For those who worked directly on the investigation, the case remained memorable not only for its outcome, but for the emotional complexity it carried throughout the process. Investigators are often trained to maintain professional distance, but certain scenes resist that separation. The image of a burned backyard, the process of reconstructing a timeline from fragmented accounts, and the necessity of engaging with both clinical and emotional interpretations of behavior all contribute to a case that stays with individuals long after the paperwork is filed away. In correctional and mental health systems, cases like this also contribute to ongoing discussions about long-term assessment and supervision. The question of how to evaluate risk over time, particularly when initial behavior is shaped by mental health crises, remains one of the most difficult challenges in the field. Even when individuals show stability over extended periods, the original act continues to define how risk is perceived, creating a persistent tension between rehabilitation and precaution. For the public, however, the case gradually transitions from immediate concern to distant memory, resurfacing only when triggered by similar events or broader societal debates. Yet, even in this reduced visibility, it retains a quiet presence. It becomes part of the background understanding of how fragile domestic environments can be and how quickly routine can shift into irreversible consequence without external warning. What remains most striking about the case, even after legal resolution, is not any single piece of evidence or testimony, but the way it forces confrontation with uncertainty in human behavior. It challenges the assumption that long-term familiarity between individuals guarantees predictability. It reveals how financial strain, health decline, psychological instability, and relational tension can coexist without obvious rupture until a moment of crisis forces them into visibility. In reflecting on Carmen Henderson's life, those who knew him often return to the same conclusion in different words. He was not defined by how he died, but by how he lived. His years of service, his presence in his community, and the consistency of his character remain the most enduring aspects of his memory. The tragedy that ended his life does not erase the decades that preceded it, even if it inevitably reshapes how those decades are remembered. And so the story settles into a form that is neither fully closed nor fully open. The legal system has completed its function, assigning responsibility within the framework it is designed to uphold. But the human questions remain active in quieter ways, carried in memory, in professional reflection, and in the ongoing effort to understand how such events can occur within the boundaries of ordinary life. The case becomes less about a single moment in time and more about the continuing challenge of interpreting what that moment means in a broader understanding of human vulnerability.